Hi, Pop.
Hi.
So, I thought it would be nice just to get some of your history, your own personal history, your family history, some memories, things like that. Mom was saying that uh, it might be a nice idea to start with, what you remember of your parents, your grandparents, where they came from. So, why don't you start talking a little bit about that first?
Well, I only knew my mother's mother. Her name was Lucy. And the other grandparents I don't remember. I may have seen them when I was tiny, but I don't remember either of them. And I don't really remember my mother's father at all. Uh, as far as my parents were concerned, my father came from the Bronx. He grew up there in the Bronx, and he went to eighth grade, and then he went to work, and he did a number of different things. I think at night he sold tickets to the railroad, and in the daytime he worked in a dye works. He told me about that. About uh, at one time the police department wanted to get a uniform blue color, and my father said it's impossible because every batch of dye comes out slightly different. He knew about that. And I don't know when he started as a welder, but he got himself, into that trade, and he did that. And he did that until he was in his 60s. And he had his own shop called Poughkeepsie Welding Works. And it was at a couple of different locations in Poughkeepsie. The first one I think was on Water Street, and then the one after that was 34 Mansion Street, which was not far from the post office. So he used to get his mail in a post office box. He just walked over to the post office. And he was active doing that kind of work up until his early 60s, I think it was, when he finally stopped doing that. And my mother worked at the telephone company when she was young. I remember her talking about that. And later on, she worked for, I think it was Wallace Company. They had a department store in Poughkeepsie. Um, I don't know how many different relatives you want to talk about at this time. There was a number. And my father had two brothers, Arthur and Frank. Frank was the oldest brother, and he had a sister, and that was Margaret, who was I knew as Peggy. And she was the one who went to high school. And she went to high school in New York City, and then she went to work for at Westchester Lighting Company, which eventually was absorbed by Con Edison, and that's where she worked most of her life. Uh, Frank and Arthur they worked in the same type of work that my father did. They were, you know, welders, iron workers, stuff like that. I don't know how much you want to go into my mother's family.
Well, so your mother grew up in an Italian family, right?
Yeah,
And she spoke Italian, I assume, at home.
yeah, she did. She went to a school that was run by German nuns, I think. So she was taught by nuns, so she knew a little bit of German, and I guess, and uh, I remember her talking about the priest who was the head of the school. His name was, I think, Father Osfog or something like that. let's see, she had, her older sister was Frances, and that's Johnny Guzzo's mother. And then I think she was next in line, but I'm not sure about the order of where her brother Johnny, he might have been the next oldest, but he died in the Philippines during World War II in the Bataan Death March. And then she had another brother, Jerome, and then her another sister, Teresa, whoever we call Tessie.
Right.
And the youngest was Uncle Joe. And he had the Mid-Hudson Gas Company, that he was one of the officers there. Before that, I remember he worked for Coca-Cola Bottling, which had a place right near the grade school on Raymond Avenue. I think there was maybe a car or auto body shop there now or something. But I remember him, when I was real little, I remember him when he was still in high school. I must have been about 4 or 5 years old then.
Yeah.
That takes care of the members of that family.
And so what about her family? When did they come from Italy?
I think her father was from Sicily and her mother was from Naples. And from what I understand, her mother was previously married, but her husband died. It was a very tragic situation. I don't know, any other...
Do you know when they came?
No, I really don't.
Yeah.
But there were other relatives that lived in the Poughkeepsie area, because my grandfather's brother was Andrew Gasmano, and he was the barber, Uncle Andy the barber. Unfortunately, the members of that family, his children, didn't speak to my mother's family for years, because the two brothers, my grandfather and my uncle, nobody knows what happened between them, but they wouldn't talk to each other.
Mm.
So therefore the cousins didn't talk to each other either.
As things go. Yeah.
And that lasted for a long time. After my grandmother died, they came to her funeral, and then everybody started talking to each other again.
Yeah. What about on your father's side? When did they come?
Oh, it must have been in the late 1890s, maybe, or maybe even the early 1890s. I don't have the information. I never got it. Aunt Peggy was going to send it to me, and then it never came.
Hmm.
But Uncle Frank was the oldest, and then Aunt Peggy was next, I believe. And then my father, he was born in 1901, and Arthur was born later. He was the youngest. But I'm not really quite sure about what, I think it was before 1900, though, earlier than that. But they probably came over around 1890 or something like that. The only thing I know about anything before that was my great-grandfather was supposed to be a captain of a ferry boat in the North Sea. I heard that.
Hmm.
My father's father, my grandfather, worked for some company, and he was like an inventor. He came up with ideas. He was an idea man. And therefore, everything that he did belonged to the company. So he never really got a lot of credit for what things that he did.
Yeah.
But I remember I had it for a while, a bottle of ink that he supposedly made himself, and some pens. And my father told me that when they had a Christmas tree, his father would make the tree symmetrical by moving branches and putting them in different places.
Huh.
So he must have been kind of a perfectionist.
Yeah.
My,
And your
my-
grandfather's name?
his name?
Yeah.
He was Frank.
He was Frank also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it was Franz or
Right.
Francis or whatever. Probably it's German. It was probably Franz. Now on my grandmother's side, her name was Fanny Junker, and she came from a family who were known for very big people, and that's why I think Sean is kind of a throwback to them, because they were all people who were supposedly over 6 feet tall, and many of them were Kaiser's guards because of their size. And I know she had relatives in Australia, and I think somebody was also in the Netherlands, and she had an uncle. I think it was her uncle. I don't know but I know that my father used to refer to his uncle who was in California. Maybe he was, I don't think he was her brother. So, but he was something like when my father went to California to visit him. He said he was maybe 90 something then. So he lived quite a number of years, And Aunt Peggy lived to be 95 when, she moved to Arizona when she probably in her 60s after she retired. She didn't marry her husband, Uncle Ted, whose name was actually Otis T. Link, Link. So her name changed from Linich to Link. They lived out in Arizona for a long time.
Yeah, I remember that.
I think he lived to be about 80, 81 or something like that. She lived to be 95. I got to blow my nose.
Right to your right.
Oh yeah. We've got some photos here. So these are your grandparents, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my father's mother and father.
And these are their children, right?
3 of them.
Three of them. That's 3 of them. This boy is Uncle Frank. That's Aunt Peggy. And this is my father. And in those days, when little boys were infants, they wore dresses. And I remember you asking me about that when you were a little kid, and you said, or I think you even said to your grandfather, she said, Grandpa, when you was little, you was a girl?
Famous story.
Yeah.
So tell me about your memories of growing up on...
Well, when I was real little, we lived in Roachdale near the Wapajuice Creek. And I can remember being there. I was probably only 4 years old when I'm remembering this stuff. But I remember being there, being by the creek. I remember fishing there. And I remember being there with my father and they had some friends there. and I remember tasting beer. They were giving me a little bit of beer to taste. But that's about all I remember about Rochdale. I know that later, after we moved from there, the house burned down. There was a fire at the house that we had lived in, and the house was gone. After that, we moved to, I think it was Worrell Avenue, which is the place we lived in was near where that pizza place is on the main street in Worrell Avenue.
Yep.
I think it was a house just behind there. And then there, I think probably I was still around maybe 5. We moved a couple of times. And we lived on Glenwood Avenue. And I think that house is probably still there. I don't remember the number. Then from Glenwood Avenue, my father had the house built on Arlington Avenue, which was then, didn't even have a number on it. And we moved to that house. And from there, that's where we stayed for a long time. And I went to school in Raymond Avenue. Not even a school anymore.
Right,
you know.
same place that I went years later.
We called it Arlington Grade School or the Raymond Avenue School, and later it became the Arthur May School. Now they're going to tear it down and, put in some other buildings or something.
Yeah.
Then from there, after 6th grade, I went over to what's now the grade school, which used to be a combination junior-senior high school. They had from 7th grade to 12th at that school at that time. Later it became the middle school.
Right.
And now it's a grade school. And I never went to kindergarten, which was probably not a good idea, but they didn't, for some reason, they didn't send me to kindergarten. So when I went to 1st grade, it was really an upsetting thing for me to have to go to school.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't used to it. But after a while, I got used to it. But I was, from what I can recall, my mother told me that I was drawing Mickey Mouse when I was 4 years old. So I've been drawing for as long as I can remember. And I still do now. And I was always good at reading. And part of it was that I learned somehow to read comic books. And I read other books that I still have a couple of the books here that I read when I was a little kid that were Walt Disney books. School Days in Disneyville and
Right.
Mickey Never Fails, But when I went through grade school, they would take me from my class to another class because my reading level was advanced. So I was always good at reading. And because I was good at reading, I could find out other things if I wanted to by going to the library. Then they did, that's way before the internet. So if you wanted to find out stuff, you go to the library and look things up in the library. So I always spent time in the library in grade school and also in when I was in junior high and high school. And actually, when I was in junior high, I used to help in the library. So the librarians knew me well.
That's good.
Yeah. As far as my activities were concerned outside of school, I did the usual kid stuff. Play ball and wound up becoming interested in wrestlers when I was still young. I remember going to the circus with my father, and they had a wrestling event afterwards, and I saw the wrestlers come out, and I was kind of interested in, what about these guys? What are they going to do? But my father wouldn't do it. He knew what was going on, and he decided to go home. He wasn't going to pay the extra to see the wrestlers, so I didn't. But then in the late 40s, when television started, every night of the week, professional wrestling was on. So I remember that my Uncle Frank and his wife, Aunt Ethel, they knew George Bothner, who was a famous wrestler. He was not a big guy, he was a lightweight. And he ran a gymnasium where all the people from wrestling, boxing, and a lot of vaudeville performers and so on, they would go there. I never got to see that. I heard about it, but I never got to see it. But they told me, professional wrestling is not something you want to get into. They never encouraged me about that. But I was still determined that I wanted to do it. And we used to watch wrestling on television, and my favorite was Antonino Rocca, who was called Argentina Rocca because he came from Argentina, although I think he was born in Italy. He became a very popular wrestler in this area around New York, and although he had been in other parts of the country. He was more or less an acrobatic type of guy, although he was, pretty well built. He had very strong legs, and he can do flips and things like that, and flying drop kicks, and he was very famous for that, for jumping up and kicking a guy. I later found out that they were falling down for him because it was an illusion. He wasn't really knocking the guy down. They fell down on purpose. Well, I got interested in becoming a wrestler, and our school didn't have wrestling. The only times they had wrestling was when I put on what they called gym demonstrations, and a couple of guys would get out there and we'd try to do some wrestling, but I learned a little bit that way. And then later on, I started going to the YMCA. At first, they didn't have any wrestling, they had boxing, so I tried a little bit of that. But I didn't really like the boxing that much, and the guy wasn't really teaching anything. I was there to be like a punching bag for somebody else. So when they started, a couple of guys came and they started offering wrestling lessons. So I got into it, and we got to do some amateur wrestling. And once I got finished, and got further along with it, I won the state championship for the YMCA 2 years in a row. And then I decided to go and try to become a professional wrestler. And the thing turned out to be something that gave me a lot of information about wrestling, knowing that the professional wrestling was more like stuntman work. But I also, at the same time, learned a lot of self-defense and wrestling tactics that were beyond amateur wrestling. And so, although I didn't make a lot of money as a professional wrestler, I learned a lot, and eventually turned that into my self-defense course, which came later when I was around 33 years old. I started that. But one interesting thing was Antonino Rocca was on one of the shows that I worked in Newark, New Jersey. So I was on the same card with Antonino Rocca, and I got to meet him and talk to him, and found out that he wasn't anywhere near as big as they said he was, but he seemed to be a pretty nice guy. Although he wasn't much of a wrestler as far as real wrestling was concerned, he was a very good showman. very popular. I played football in high school, but I didn't really like it that much. And I had a very bad head injury. This part of my eye here got hit and opened up, so I had to have stitches in there. And I had 2 black eyes, and this eye was totally closed. I couldn't even open it unless I grabbed hold with my fingers and pried it open. So that was kind of discouraging. I played 1 more year of football after that, and I didn't want to play anymore. I think I probably had a concussion at the time, but nobody bothered about concussions then. The sport that I really liked in high school was track and field. I was a shot putter, and I went from 8th grade to the 12th grade doing the shot. And when I started out, I was probably the worst one, but by the time I got to my junior year, I was the best one in the school. So that was, to me, it was more fun than playing football.
Right.
I did pretty good in school. I wound up in the top 10 in my graduating class. So it had a pretty good average. It was over 90%. I don't remember exactly what it was for final average. So I was an honor student.